The Scourge of Tillingen. From the Personal Journal of Ciaran Fells O Sionaith, year 1002. It was a mistake to come to Tillingen. Not a mistake in the traditional sense, for I completed my business in the town with no setbacks, but a mistake in an abstract sense. I witnessed something disconcerting, and even though I write this having returned to Ard Skellig, it unsettles me still. The singular fort in Tillingen and the two others that lie westerly to it have fed the Yeruga's currents with blood. The wars of the last centuries were not kind to Brugge. Yet in all there is some silver lining. The blood moss that grows on the Yeruga's banks in these areas has evolved into a powerful deoxicant, or so my druidic acquaintances recently informed me. I came to Tillingen to harvest some of that moss, to test the druid's claims. Note, initial tests seem promising. Observations recorded in Clinical Journal 25. Having completed my objective, I decided to postpone my departure until the following night. The moon would be new then, and the stars, my points of navigation while traveling over the sea, brighter. I find I must revise my earlier statement. My mistake was not in coming to Tillingen, but in staying too long. I spent the night before I was due to leave, relaxing in my room at the town's ample inn. In light of the waning moon, I observed the town square, the shutters of my window open to let in the dry night air. I had set a pot of tea to boil over the room's small fire. As I watched the dark town, I saw one brave soul, a young girl, venture into the darkness, hurrying toward the well at the square's center. Everything from that moment happened quickly. An inky shape detached itself from the night sky and dove at the girl. She screamed. The kettle shrieked. I turned my head away for but a moment. When my gaze snapped back to the window, the girl was alone, and the roof of the well was destroyed. The child continued to shout. Her cries lit candles in neighboring houses and summoned the townsfolk to the square. Yet beneath this din, I heard other sounds of equal distress, hissing, the swish of water, and something like knives against the whetstone. When these faded to silence, I felt a throbbing dread begin in my skull. I hurried downstairs. The innkeeper was adamant that I stay indoors. "You don't understand, Master Surgeon," she pleaded, blocking the inn door with her thin frame. "It's monsters out there." "I heard a child shouting," I said. "She may be hurt." The woman nodded sadly. "It always takes the little ones, seems like." "This monster, do you know what it might be?" I called to mind the glimpse I'd had of the shadow. Maybe I was mistaken. Perhaps it wasn't a vampire, so the alderman says. It attacks nearly every week now, damn scourge of this town. She spat superstitiously at the threshold. There was a ferocious pounding on the inn door and a male voice shouting. The innkeeper opened the door a crack, which the man, corpulent and with the bearing of an alderman, took as his invitation to barge in. He pointed at me. "You the healer from Skellige?" "I am he," I answered. Behind the alderman stood the open door with a view of the crowd that was gathering in the square, torches blazing. I strained to hear any hiss or schnick of claw against stone, but heard nothing. "Come with me," commanded the alderman. I felt the usual self-consciousness as he led me through the crowd. Though I knew it was irrational, I feared that the frightened and angry humans would see through me. I had but make one misstep, and they would realize that I was akin to the monster that terrified their village and exsanguinated their children. After almost a millennium, that feeling still arises whenever I leave home and walk among unfamiliar people. The girl who had miraculously escaped death sat in the dirt several yards from the well and sobbed. 3 women, her mother among them, knelt near her. It was to this little group that the alderman introduced me. Fortunately, the girl bore only a few lacerations from the fragments of the demolished roof. Frightened of the vampire, she had thrown her arms in front of her face at the last second. Her terror had saved her eyes. As I balmed and bandaged her wounds, I listened for any noise from the well. I also tried to convince myself, despite having sensed nothing of the sort, that my kin had simply turned into mist and escaped. "Oi! Piotr! Jacek!" someone shouted. "We got it. Think it's dead." The girl taken care of, I stood, turned around, and saw what had become of my kin. With rope and hooks they had pulled him from the well. He lay at the stone base, a board from the well's roof through his abdomen. He seemed unconscious. I find it difficult to write about what transpired from that point on, partly because of my own conflicted thoughts. To be frank, I've lived as a humanist for so vast a time that I can empathize with them easily. Thus, revulsion rose within me when I beheld my kin, the scourge of Dillingen. His careless slaughter of humans, whether for sadistic pleasure or to satiate thirst, disgusted me, though I knew myself capable of such destruction. At the same time, I felt the compassion towards him that the humans around me would find appalling. I willed, as if my own will would make any difference, for him to awaken and flee. To my great concern, he appeared unable to do either. The townsfolk encircled him. There was some debate among the men as regards the best way to kill a vampire, a pointless exercise, but one I hoped would buy my kin time to melt into the night air as mist. I also began to fear that if he awoke enraged, the town would pay the price, and I, caught between the two, would be helpless to stop the slaughter without exposing myself or fighting my own kind. No, that's not entirely true. It doesn't matter what I write. I know that I would have killed him to save these humans. I'm already anathema. Ultimately, I was not put into such a position that night. A young man, impatient with the crowd's inaction, drew his scythe above his head and brought the powerful stroke down over the vampire's neck, severing the head. My kin's surprise and pain seared my own thoughts like a red-hot poker, and I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. He had returned to consciousness at that very moment, only to receive the scythe's blow, and I had foolishly been reaching out towards him with my mind. I withdrew it, but that hardly mattered. He had gone silent. After that, I had no desire to continue watching how the people of Dillingen punished their attacker. I slipped back to my room and latched my shutters, but I could still hear them. I heard them sharpen stakes and bless jars of holy water. I heard them debate what to do with the body, and eventually cart the remains away. And finally, in the few hours before dawn, the townsfolk retired to sleep and dreamt of nights without terror. There is one last aspect of this incident that I feel is worth mentioning, if only because it provides some background information to the events I witnessed that night, and thus makes them even harder to forget. The morning after the incident, I could not bear to stay in town. I chose to spend the day wandering the woods, alone with my thoughts, and then depart at moonrise. The day was bright and chill. Autumn would arrive soon. As I walked beneath yellowing trees a few kilometers away from town, I heard a sudden cacophony of bird calls. Glancing toward the noise, I saw her, a slim figure clad in a gray cloak, flitting through the trees as quickly as the birds which heralded her presence. A bruxa. Curious, I followed her, unconcerned with concealing my presence. I am sure she was aware of me, but she let me follow anyway. She led me to a part of the forest where trees grew so thick together they blotted out the sky. At the base of one tree was a mound of dirt and stones which I recognized as a freshly dug and covered grave. All in the dirt and hanging from the branches above were talismans to ward off evil and copious amounts of garlic bulbs. The bruxa threw back her hood and turned to me, her auburn hair falling over her shoulder. "I do not know you," she declared. "No," I said, "I expect you wouldn't. I am only in Brugge for business. My home lies across the sea. Please call me Kjaran." "Tell me why you followed me." In answer, I looked past her to the new grave. She knelt by the mound and began to pick off the garlic bulbs littering it, flinging them into the bushes. "My name is Lilith." "I was in town last night, Lilith. I saw what happened." Lilith sighed and began to remove the talismans as she had the bulbs. Silence grew between us. Even the birds were quiet. "It was bound to happen sooner or later," she said at last. "Emil was reckless. He drank too much. You might say he got what he deserved." She tried to sound cold, but her voice broke. "I'm sorry. Was he your mate? I asked and instantly regretted it. She bared her fangs and scoffed, but then grew serious. Yes. No. Well, we could have been. I loved him. He loved me too, I think. But he loved drunken oblivion much more than me, maybe more than anything else. Who knows? I felt bad when I ended it. Having cleared the grave of its rustic adornments, Lilith stood and replaced her hood. Anyway, she said, I've only come to say my farewell. It would be wise to leave this area. Your friend's actions have endangered you, exposed you. I know. I was planning to leave the countryside anyway, see the cities. Kovir, Novigrad, maybe Vizima. Now could you leave me? There are words I must say, and I would prefer privacy. I nodded. Of course. Thank you, Lilith. For what? For being open with me. Farewell. Farewell. I left her and was left alone with my thoughts. 50 to 60 years. I estimate 50 to 60 years for him to regenerate. He's young. His powers have not yet reached their full potential. I wonder if he will remain in Brugge once recovered or choose some other haunt. Lilith was right. His punishment was just. The human-like hatred I felt for him had dissipated. For a moment I considered it would not take very much blood. But no. No, all creatures must reap what they sow, immortals included. Perhaps immortals most of all. The Blood of the Dead, Part 1, Year 1010. Emil awoke in darkness, the total emptiness of complete sensory deprivation. He saw only with his mind's eye as his body knit itself back together within the earth. There was no use in connecting the mind to a still healing body. And in this form of consciousness, he was unaware of the passage of time. There was only himself and the unending present. That couldn't be right. What had happened to him? He tried to recall. Nothing else seemed to exist before this moment, this awakening. Maybe this was and always had been his existence. It wasn't unpleasant, he realized. Certainly a crucial portion of time, the past, was missing, but wasn't that for the best? The word itself seemed dark and painful. It had no place in the now. And what use was the future? That word implied change, and he wished nothing about the strange peace he felt to change. Year 1015. Something lurked in the periphery of his mind, exuding potential energy. Despite his attempts at ignorance, it inched closer, trying to make itself known. In his mind's ear, he heard its plaintive cries, like a child beseeching a parent to listen. No, please, let me be in peace a while longer, whispered his mind's voice. Beneath the earth, a million neurons connected, restoring time and memory with the sharpness of a scythe's blade. Year 1034. In much the same way as he had previously only been aware of the present, Emil was now submerged in the past. And with his past all around him, he could see how it had culminated into one horrible decision that left him functionally dead. But where had it begun? It would be easy to say everything had started the first time he'd taken a drink. The details eluded him, but he remembered the girl, the nudges from a friend, and the confidence boost the blood gave him. In all honesty, though, it had probably begun earlier. At some point, a desire had risen in him, stronger than any lust. He wanted to be accepted, to be liked, not to be the odd, awkward one out. The blood was a tool to achieve that end. It was only a tool until it became a crutch. The person that he saw in his memories from that point on looked like him, spoke like him, but was merely a slave, in service to a feeling of confident invincibility. Little by little, the blood had mastered him, sucked away all dignity and self-control, and left behind a wraith that was barely tolerated by the ones it had so wanted to impress. He had chosen that path, held out his wrists to be shackled. Anger boiled in his mind. Not one of his so-called friends had bothered to revive him. He didn't blame them. Whoever spared blood to revive him would irrevocably link the two of them as brethren. And what person in their right mind would take on that shame, that stain, for all eternity. It was better this way. Alone, he would never be a burden to anyone. He would never be the cause for embarrassment or disgrace. Without the distraction of others, he would win back what his foolish past self had given up: control, freedom, dignity. As if in response to Emil's declaration, the mind-body connection linked up, and he screamed as an overload of sensory information drove away all other thought. Year 1052. The soil and stones of the grave mound fell away as Emil dug himself out of the shallow grave he had spent 50 years in. He stretched and rolled his shoulders, neck, and wrists. As expected, his body was sore, the joints stiff, the muscles tight. Mercifully, it was dawn. He knew that his eyes, having spent so long unseeing, would have ached at any strong light. He brushed the dirt from his body and winced as he touched tender, new skin. This was the first time he'd undergone a major regeneration. Someone had told him once what he might expect, but their words had not done the true experience justice. The feeling of mind and body connecting still lingered painfully. He knew the whereabouts he had ended up, the town near the mouth of the big river, He strained to remember. The name was there in his mind, but stuck in a post-regeneration cerebral mire. Yaruga, he finally said, and realized that his voice was just as sore as the rest of him. The name of the nearby town had short little vowels, he remembered, but unlike the Yaruga, which even vampires used as a landmark, the town's name was unimportant. What was important, he decided, was where he would go from here. Emil turned towards the east, where golden light streamed. The sun was rising. In that direction, bathed in gold, were places he knew too well, places on which he had left a wide, bloody mark. Those marks were reaching for him now, sure as the tendrils of the dawn reached for him. He turned his back on the sunrise and faced the west. The sky was darker there, and clouds gathered on the far horizon where the sea lay, where the unknown lay. There was only one way to go. He took flight. Soaring through the air restored some of his calm and confidence. He recalled times when he had free-fallen from cliffs, only to pull up laughing before he hit the rocky bottoms. Everything would be all right. The day had long since caught up with him and lit up the vast sea which stretched out in all directions. He called to mind maps he had seen of this world. There were supposed to be islands in the west, which the small Amurun clan of vampires called home. The humans that lived there had the sea in their blood and were particularly hardy against cold and storm, but they were fewer in numbers than on the continent, where the wilderness was quickly being crowded out by large cities and towns. On the islands, it would be easier to avoid both humans and vampires. He had been flying for a few hours when pain suddenly flamed through his back. He had finished regenerating, surely, so what was this? Emil swallowed his fear and tried to rationalize. He must have strained a muscle somehow. It would go away. Sure enough, the pain passed after a few minutes. As he flew on, he spotted large ships on the waves, probably traveling between the islands and the continent. Though he was sure that he was flying too fast and high to be seen well, he ascended above a thin layer of cloud. He briefly wondered how high he could go, but logic cautioned that this was not the best time. He had missed logic. It was rarely present when he, surrounded by peers and a haze of blood intoxication, accepted dares of the most violent and debauched kind. Now his mind was clear, and he had already vowed never to let it become clouded again. Another hour passed, filled with coasting on favorable winds. He had calmed significantly since leaving the continent, and this was perhaps why it took him some time to notice that the air had grown still and heavy. He looked at the sea. It was darker than before. As he wondered whether these signs meant rain, the pain returned. This time it spread down his back and into his wings. It was hot and pulsing and difficult to ignore. He tried anyway. There was worse pain than this. He had heard stories of unbearable pain, cautionary tales of vampires slaughtered by witches and mages, of the kinds of torture that could be given as punishment by an unseen. This pain was nothing. Such mental fortitude unfortunately meant little to his body. And so, a little ways off the coast of Ard Skellig, Emil's wings crumpled. He spun in the air for a moment and then plummeted, his body, unbidden, abandoning its winged form altogether. From that height, the water may as well have been stone. The impact knocked what little breath he had from his lungs. He gasped and inhaled only brine. Water closed over him, sealing him beneath the waves. Beneath several meters of frigid Skellige sea, Emil tried to discern which way was up. He looked about frantically, salt stinging his eyes. There! One direction appeared lighter than the others. After what felt like an eternity, he surfaced. Emil looked around him, searching for shore, or at the very least a collection of rocks to cling to. His swimming abilities were minimal and only lasted for short distances. He had taken stock of himself and determined that he would be unable to get airborne again for a while. Fortunately, he saw what looked to be treetops rising above the horizon. The shore he finally washed up on was covered in pebbles and sloped sharply up a rocky face to meet a dense grove of trees. In the rock face was an opening tall enough to be walked through, though only a meter wide. Emil slowly stood up. The pebbles that had pressed into his skin clinked to the ground. His legs shook, his muscles burned from the swim, and he was dizzy, but he managed to take a few steps forward, and then a few more, and more after that, until he was just inside the cave. Emil leaned against a rock and looked around. The slick stone of the floor and walls was damp and carpeted in moss. The cave itself was also larger and deeper than it appeared from the outside. The light could not penetrate the very back. There were some broken crates and chests littered about, as if the place had once been used as storage. In the corner, a few yards from him, lay a grey heap. Curious, Emil limped over to it and discovered a long-since-dead human, or part of one anyway. Its head and right arm had been torn off, but the rest had been discarded into the corner. Not even at his most inebriated would he drink from something this rancid. As he stared at the corpse, Emil realized that he was cold. This was surprising. His body never paid external temperatures any mind. For a moment, the fear he had felt while falling into the sea reared its head. With no hesitation, he stripped the corpse and pulled on its blood-stained trousers and shirt. He was still cold. Suddenly, a grating screech rang through the cave. Emil spun around and stared deeply into the darkness at the back of the cave. He noticed, close to where the darkness began, piles of yellow-white rocks in various shapes and sizes. Bones. 3 shapes slunk from the darkness. They looked like harpies with great feathered wings and taut skin of a sickly purple-brown color, but seemed larger than the ones Emil was familiar with. This cave must be their nest. They shrieked at him and advanced cautiously. He held his ground. Surely they, like most other creatures he'd encountered before, wouldn't dare attack an apex predator. That was basic survival instinct. Never start what you cannot win. They leapt at him. As shock paralyzed him, Emil realized that the harpies were not being foolish. They were attacking prey weaker than themselves. He was so weak that they didn't deem him a threat. A talon raked across the side of his face and brought Emil back to the moment. He may not have been able to turn to mist or to his winged form, and he may have been fatigued, but he still had claws. His first strike slid open the abdomen of one harpy. It fell, viscera spilling onto the moss. It would have been a more impressive blow if Emil's legs hadn't given out at the last second. He collapsed next to his victim. The remaining 2 harpies stopped in confusion, unsure if they should run from or finish off their opponent. Emil grit his teeth and willed himself to stand. He hadn't spent 50 years regenerating just to be defeated by these base creatures. He bared his fangs and hissed. One harpy ignored this warning and charged. Emil dodged clumsily, and the harpy's talons grazed his arm. He may be determined to win, but sheer willpower could only conjure so much stamina. They traded blows. He shredded its wing, and it struck his back. Unable to fly away, the wounded harpy besieged its friend for help. In a blur of adrenaline that surprised even himself, Emil never gave it the chance. He ripped open the creature's thigh. Warm blood sprayed over him, turning his vision red. The remaining harpy fled, and the injured one crumpled in a heap. Still riding a wave of adrenaline, Emil staggered out onto the beach. He waded into the water and washed the harpy's blood and his own away. His injuries were healing, but slower than he would have expected. Behind him he heard a tiny, shuddering gasp. The harpy he'd wounded had died. At the sound of that last death throe, all the exhaustion that Emil had tried to keep at bay washed over him. He stumbled back into the cave and lay down a few yards from the entrance. Sleep. He needed to sleep to restore some energy. He would be all right in a few hours. When unconsciousness beckoned, Emil succumbed without a fight. The Blood of the Dead, Part 2. The dawn broke, as it always did, over the evil and good, over humans and elder races, and over monsters. Its tendrils illuminated lovers still clasped in embrace, and children in their cots. Some rays of light flashed off the damp stone of a shore cave in Ard Skellig. They even pierced the darkness at the cavern's back, where Emil sat against a stone, clad in a dead man's clothes, his knees pulled up to his chest, and his head resting on them. He had chased sleep for hours, but failed. He felt perpetually on the verge of vomiting, though he didn't know if this was due to the pain writhing around his abdomen or the way the cave seemed to be swaying back and forth. Sometimes, when he was on the edge of sleep, he felt a warm body press against his and opened his eyes to see an apparition of Lily caressing him. He moaned and reached for her, but she vanished as quickly as she'd appeared. Other hallucinations were far less comforting. He saw and felt the scythes blow again and again, and the fall into the sea, but this time he sank endlessly into the depths. The worst was a ring of dark figures closing in around him, hands reaching, white eyes flashing. They wanted to pull him into the darkness at the back of the cave where a cage waited. "No, I'm not like him," Emil cried out. "Please, I was never that bad, just foolish." He leapt to his feet, which dispersed the vision, but also caused him such vertigo that he sank back to the floor. Either something had gone wrong with his regeneration, or this was all the result of not drinking blood. Maybe his body had become so dependent on it that going without was too much to bear. Then he saw again the vision of the cage in the dark and thought, as quietly as it was possible to think, "Maybe I'm going mad." A wind whipped up outside and came groaning through the cave entrance. "Maybe I'm going insane." The gust pulled at Emil's clothes and hair and sent an impossible chill through him. He tried to push it away. Was he prepared to live an entire existence crouched in a cave, lost in pain and fantasy? And what if it only got worse? Everything had seemed easy and bright when he'd left the continent. Of course he knew it would be difficult to simply walk away, but he had counted on his determination to sustain him. And now that the moment of perseverance and courage had arrived, he was too scared to do anything but cower in fear of pain and of failure. Emil tried to recall the feeling of invincibility that being drunk gave him. Even a modicum of that confidence would be enough. It was obvious that he couldn't stay here. As soon as his symptoms subsided to a manageable level, he needed to leave, find food and water, then wait out the pain if there was an end to it. He didn't want to think much beyond that. In one of his hallucinations, he had imagined the future. It was very like the present, but he was much older and still wandering, purposeless and alone. It was deep into the night by the time Emil felt well enough to try standing. He clutched the wet stone of the cave wall for support, but stood nonetheless. His steps forward were shaky but sure. He did not know under whose power he was moving, but it couldn't have been his own. It could be fear's. Fear was strong enough to do what confidence and belief couldn't, and the darkness at the back of the cave scared him. The moment he emerged onto the shore, Emil realized how dulled his senses had become. It was as if the world had suddenly grown smaller and quieter. The full moon was strong and shone unhindered by clouds, but Emil found he could not see as far off as he should be able to. He walked a little ways down the beach until the rock face the cave was set into sloped down to meet the shore, and he could scramble into the dense cluster of trees. Surely there was an abundance of nocturnal creatures in this forest, but Emil heard only a few. What he found most disconcerting, however, was his diminished sense of smell. Without it, he may as well have been blind. It was slow going. Though the pain in his body had diminished to a persistent ache, and the vertigo had reduced to dizziness, Emil got out of breath easily. He limped between tree trunks and used them to keep his balance. His face burned with effort and shame. It was pitiful. He could barely walk a straight line, and his pace might as well have been a crawl. The air was chill. Some trees were almost bare of leaves. Winter was approaching. The cold should not have affected him, but Emil shivered. The full moon's glint on the water put him in mind of a roaring bonfire, which he had once seen humans make on a feast day. With a croaking, rueful chuckle, he suspected himself to be the first vampire to ever yearn for the warmth of a fire. Instead of a blaze, the first comfort Emil found after an hour of walking was a small stream that rushed over rocks on its way to the sea. He drank slowly and deeply. The water was cold and tasted slightly of iron, which helped to satiate his thirst for the time being. Since he had nothing with which to carry the water, Emil decided to follow the stream. Suddenly, a great cracking noise rang out across the forest. Emil looked toward the sound and wished he could turn the mist. This wood felt more primal than any on the continent. There could be any number of ancient monstrosities lurking amid the dense foliage. Humans and wild beasts were nothing to be afraid of, but a Leshen, fiend, werewolf? He didn't want to tangle with those, and certainly not in this pathetic state. The sound rang out again, reverberating between the trees. And then again, maybe 20 seconds later. And again. Too regular to be a beast. Curiosity propelled him forward. Keeping the stream in sight, Emil waded through the moonlit darkness. 100 meters more, and there it was. A large house nestled into the forest as if it had grown there. Some ways away lay a substantial pile of wood, and next to that pile, wielding an axe, was a man. Emil tensed. Humans usually preferred the daylight, but perhaps the approaching winter made them do the unexpected. Regardless, he didn't trust himself to get any closer. His heart was already pounding, heat rising to his face. He turned to go. The thought of food stayed his steps. There would certainly be some in the house, and he could probably get it without getting any nearer to the woodpile. Of course, it would be easier to kill the human, but they were so fragile. They shattered like glass against stone and spilled blood everywhere, a risk not worth taking. Emil gave the house a wide berth and circled around behind it until the man was out of sight. Then he skirted the side and found an unlatched door. He pushed it open and slipped inside. Moonlight streamed in through the windows, so, despite his weakened night vision, Emil discerned the house's layout. The main room he stood in was open, but closed doors presumably led to other parts of the house, and in the far corner a flight of stairs coursed upward. There was a great stone pillar against one wall, a hearth, and a table with chairs. He headed in that direction and started to open cabinets and sift through the contents of shelves. All he found were bottles and jars filled with strange powders and liquids with such strong smells that, were his senses up to par, would be overpowering. Any space not covered by glassware was taken up by leather-bound books. There was no food here. As he turned to explore other parts of the house, a glint of metal caught his eye. On the bottom shelf of a corner bookcase, pressed between other large but unimpressive volumes, was a book with an intricately gilded spine. Another axe stroke sounded from outside. The pile of logs the man still needed to chop had looked large. Emil knelt down and pulled out the book. The cover was as intricate as the spine, though it had no title. It wasn't until he got several paragraphs in that Emil realized he was reading vampiric script. He blinked and turned the page. There was more of it. He flipped through the book. His native language covered every page. The book seemed to be a survey of the islands across the sea. Emil grabbed another book. This one was written in the human language of the continent. He tried to piece together the words, something about water, plants, heat. "Greetings," said a kind voice. Emil spun around, claws extended, instinct overcoming common sense. He lashed out and, quicker than his dulled senses could track, found himself pinned against the shelving. The person who had greeted him, whose hand was now pressed against his chest, was the man who had been chopping wood. The stranger smiled, revealing fangs. With a spasm of fear, Emil realized that he had made a fatal error. The aura of authority that had washed over him the moment the stranger touched him, a strange new feeling of insignificance and a desire to bow his head. This had to be an elder. He'd attacked an elder. The other vampire seemed to be expending little effort to keep Emil pinned against the bookshelf. He had, to Emil's mind, strange features. Eyes like emerald for one thing, and red hair like an elf's, but much darker and tied back. This strangeness, however, did nothing to make him less intimidating. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, yet it had presence. It commanded attention and respect. "Were you truly trying to kill me? If so, I suppose I should be honored that the elders of the continent have not forgotten me." No, you startled me. I thought, how embarrassing to admit it, I thought you were a human." At this, the emerald-eyed vampire laughed suddenly and heartily. Emil flinched. "Thought I was human? I think I'll take that as a compliment." He could kill me, Emil thought, easily and quickly. I don't think I would even fight. Pain for a moment, and then oblivion. "Stop," he shouted, more to drive his own thoughts away than persuade his captor. "I'm not worth killing." The emerald-eyed vampire drew back the hand pinning Emil to the bookcase and looked him over. An emotion somewhere between pity and regret crossed his face. "Who are you?" "I'm Gorasham, from the continent. My name—" Suddenly the pain from the cave returned with a vengeance, sparking across Emil's body, leaping from muscle to muscle. He cried out and felt hands catching him before he collapsed. The next thing he knew, he was being helped into a chair by the hearth. The emerald-eyed vampire lit a fire, which blazed up brightly in a flash of soothing heat. Emil grimaced at the flames and waited for this wave of pain to pass. A few minutes later, a mug was pressed into his hands. "It tastes terrible, but it should work." The voice still had its presence and authority, but it was softer now, not so frightening. It was the voice that had greeted him. The yellow liquid in the mug trembled as Emil's hands shook. "It's for pain," the other vampire said, sitting in a chair across from Emil. You're the elder of this island." "No, I'm not. I have no authority among our kind. You know, I wasn't going to fight you. I was taking precautions. You're the first one of us I've met in a long time, and when you attacked me, I assumed— it doesn't matter. My name in Ard Skellig is Kjaran O'Sheonaith." It was no vampiric name Emil had ever heard. He met Kjaran's green eyes. They watched him concernedly, but what did they see? Before he could think himself out of doing so, Emil drained the mug of yellow liquid. It tasted wretched, strangely sweet and rancid at the same time. He coughed. Kjaran took the empty mug from him. "Unless the Karasham have left the continent, you're far from home. Listen, I didn't catch your name before. It doesn't have to be your real one." "Emil Regis Rohelek Tertiev Godefroy." "Would you tell me how you came to be rummaging around my house and, what's more, mistake me for human? You didn't offend me, I'm just curious." Emil told his story, leaving out what circumstances that led to his regeneration in the first place. As he spoke, the medicine took effect and dulled the edges of his pain. He could think clearly. Kjaran listened intently. At one point, he got up and returned with a chunk of brown bread, a handful of white roots, and a few strips of dried meat, which Emil gratefully devoured. "That's all I have in terms of food at the moment. I should really go to town soon. Anyway, you decided moments after regenerating to cross the sea. Daring but rash." "I needed to leave that place quickly," Emil said. "And you actually made it. I'm impressed. Oh, those were Arinias that attacked you. This region's breed of harpy." When the tale was over, Emil lapsed into a silence and stared at the fire. He tried not to make himself sound too pathetic in his retelling, but it was hard to salvage a story that ended with a higher vampire, senses weakened, mistaking another of his kind for a human. When Kieran spoke, though, his tone was not judgmental. You strained yourself. Flying a great distance, fighting, it may not seem like it, but it's a good thing your body gave out when it did. Still, you lasted a long time. Your will is strong. Emil had a vision of himself reclining against a stone casket, lost in a high. A human lay against his chest, the last of her blood drying around the puncture wound on her neck. No, his will was anything but strong. I have one question, Kieran continued. You said you woke up near a town on the Yaruga. Do you remember the name by any chance? Why? It's not important. Humor me. I don't know. It was a longer name. I think it started with a hard sound, then many short sounds. Dillingen, Kieran said, and the word fell heavy between them. An arrow of ice shot up Emil's spine. Yes. Excuse me. Kieran almost leapt out of the chair and disappeared up the stairs at the back of the house. Emil waited, fear rising though he couldn't say why. News of his idiotic demise couldn't have crossed the sea to be heard by a vampire of another tribe. Maybe the town meant something to Kieran, something that had nothing to do with Emil. At least he hoped that was the case. Kieran returned with a leather notebook and a stack of folded clothes. He put the clothes down on the arm of the chair and flipped through the book. When he found the page he was looking for, he skimmed it quickly, glanced at Emil, then back at the book. May I ask what caused your regeneration? Emil shifted in his chair and rolled a breadcrumb between his fingers. Shame proved stronger than fear. The humans, he said, hired a witcher. Kieran let the silence linger for a minute. Emil tried to gauge if he had bought the lie, but his face betrayed only that he was deep in thought. He closed the book. You're welcome to stay here until your body and mind have healed. It was not at all what Emil had been expecting. Beside him was a roaring fire. On his lap were breadcrumbs. It was impossible how drastically his circumstances had changed in less than 24 hours. This vampire with the strange name and an elder's bearing was extending a kindness that Emil doubted his former friends would have offered. While Emil thought, Kieran held out the stack of clothes. The medicine I gave you is powerful, but short-lasting. If you would like to bathe before it wears off, I would do so. Behind that door are the stairs down. Then take the door on the left. Thank you. While you're down there, you might want to think about this. If I'm to help you, I need to know the full extent of your ailments, as well as who you are. I've told you my name, my tribe. What else do you want? None of that matters. Who are you? Emil stared, opened his mouth, and closed it again. Then he went down the stairs, closing the door behind him. The stairs led down to a fairly large basement. As Kieran had said, the door on the left led to a room insulated with stones. It had no windows, but was furnished with a large fireplace, a stool, and some clothing hooks on the walls. In the center of the room lay a circular depression filled with water. Emil set the clothes Kieran had given him on the stool and pulled off his old ones, realizing as he did so that they were in a deplorable state, to put it mildly. The fabric was caked in mud and the blood of 3 different species, that of the dead human they'd belonged to, the Arenias, and his own. This was to say nothing of the tears or the smell. With no hesitation, he balled up the destroyed outfit and flung it into the fire. The water was warm and cloudy from minerals. Steam danced above it. Emil slipped under the surface and stayed under for a few minutes, thinking. He had no more plans, no more brilliant ideas. His original scheme, complete isolation, would surely bring madness. Still, what alternative was there? He couldn't return to a pack yet. The temptation to indulge would be too great. Living among humans was also out of the question. They were too base to offer any significant companionship, let alone intelligent conversation, and the temptation would be even worse. Emil surfaced and set about working the mats out of his hair. The atmosphere in the room had grown heavy. The air's warmth pressed in on him, and a strong herbal scent filled his nose. It was hard to think of anything else but the heat and that strangely comforting smell. He started to doze. No! He dug his fingernails into his scalp. Sleep brought only those awful visions, but it grew more difficult by the hour to resist its call. On the ledge of the bath was a white bar of soap and cloth, the latter of which he lathered and worked roughly over his body to drive off the temptation of sleep. Ciaran's last question hovered in his mind, and, as he usually did when he hadn't dazzled in a conversation, Emil tried to think of what he should have said. None of that matters. Who are you? Why was that such a difficult question to answer? Of course he knew who he was. Well, it was obvious that he was... Surely he... I don't know. The words rang out from a small corner of his mind, a corner that had gathered up its courage and said what the rest of the mind was thinking but too scared to admit. And it was the truth. Somewhere along the way, after years of living under the haze of intoxication, he had lost himself. It had been impossible to think of anything else, to be anything else, when his sole raison d'être revolved around getting drunk, enjoying being drunk, and, in his sober moments, anticipating getting drunk again. He had become one with his addiction, given up everything, his relationships, his personality, his mind, to serve it. That was why he'd resolved, as he lay buried and waiting for regeneration to take its toll, that he would be, finally, free, no matter the struggle. He would not let fear and shame rob him of that freedom. Ciaran had cleaned up the mud tracked in by his unexpected guest. Now he sat by the hearth, writing in a pocket-sized notebook, a mug of tea balanced precariously on the arm of his chair. The chair across from him, where Emil had sat before, was occupied by a brown, long-haired cat. He shut the book and looked up as Emil entered. Instead of a dead man's clothes, the young vampire now wore a light green tunic over a long-sleeved cream undershirt and brown trousers. Everything was oversized, but it gave him a far sight more dignity. Emil's damp hair left watermarks where it brushed his shoulders. I thought you drowned. Ciaran grinned wryly. You took your time. Forgive me, I was thinking. Ciaran frowned. Don't look so abashed. There's nothing to forgive. I love a long bath, if you couldn't tell. You certainly have an elaborate setup. Emil gave the barest hint of a smile, which Ciaran returned widely. Sit down. Go on, move the cat. The cat, as Emil reached down to pick her up, hissed and leapt off the chair. She's really a nice animal, Ciaran said. Just sore that you've taken her chair. She'll get over it. Anyway, what were you thinking about? Emil stared into the hearth. A log in the center of the fire finally burned into halves and threw up sparks. Your question, he said. And? Emil hesitated for only a moment, and then the words rushed out. I'm a drunk. A disgrace, have been for half a century. That's what defeated me in the end, just some humans with a scythe. I was too out of it to stop them. I haven't drunk since then, and I don't plan on ever doing so again. I know that's what's causing some of my problems. You say you can help. All right, I accept, though I have no way to repay you. Ciaran grinned again. Oh, don't talk about payments. He waved the subject away. He opened his notebook and began to leaf through it. Emil waited, trying to think of something else to say. The confession had taken the last of his strength. He was exhausted. His eyes burned with the effort of merely seeing. His mouth was dry, his thoughts drier. What must I do? Emil asked at length. The silence had grown too large for him. Ciaran glanced up from his book and looked across from him. The young vampire was tense as taut bowstring and shaking slightly. Sleep, said Ciaran. What? Replenish your energy. Let your body finish regenerating. You pushed yourself too far and you're suffering from withdrawal. Surely I don't have to explain. Of course not, but Emil searched for the right words in flames. You ask too much of me. I've tried it, several times in fact, but the moment I slacken my guard, I see and hear things which I know aren't there. It may sound hard to believe, but it's a torment. Kieran nodded and set the book on his lap. He tried to catch Emil's gaze, but it had been captured by the floor, the ceiling, the hearth. "I'll take care of everything tonight." Now he had the gaze and the confusion within it. "Forgive me my incredulousness, but how?" Green eyes and black met in the firelight. "We don't know each other well," Kieran began. "Perhaps in time we will. For now, we each have our secrets. Let my abilities be mine." "I've heard that elders can hypnotize other vampires with a word. Is that what you plan on doing?" "Still stuck on that, I see. I told you, I'm not an elder." Emil was about to protest, but Kieran continued. "More like the antithesis of one. You won't understand, but if it makes you feel better to title me, then call me a humanist." The Hand of Fate. From the personal journal of Kieran Fyles O'Shionaith. Year 1052. I am certain he is the one I saw beheaded in Dillingen 50 years ago, the one the brooks are fretted over. Everything lines up perfectly. And somehow he found his way here. Why? Humans talk about fate and destiny as a matter of fact. I've never given it much thought, yet I am faced with a situation which would be a perfect example of fate's hand. Impossible without the guiding nudge of an unseen force. What this force is depends on what mortals one asks. Some say gods, others a cosmic demiurge. But the only force I can think of tonight is the dead. There are beliefs which hold that the dead remain in this world, guiding the living, or else are reborn as a new being who, in some primal subconscious way, remembers his old life. Mortals have various ideas about what happens to them after death, but they have no place for monsters in their theologies. We are damned regardless. But what if it is possible? What if we're both being guided? Or perhaps the other theory. The similarities are certainly striking. If that were true, then this child is... I must keep my emotions from wavering. If my mind grows turbulent, my powers will be useless. I shall consider the dead some other time. Now I must think of the living. Emil? I should ask him about spelling. Regis Rohelek Tertiev Godefroy. I dug out the old records book and looked up the surnames. I believe that family would have been considered nobility in the old world. It is hard to see that heritage in him now. He carries himself as one who has lost all confidence and dignity. Therefore, I thought it best not to mention my knowledge of what happened in Dillingen 50 years ago. It's obvious he's ashamed of what's happened to him. His pride has taken a hit. How can I help him? The road ahead will be long and painful and shall strain me as well. Already I do not know if my strength will last for however long he sleeps. Still, whatever force initiated it, this is a second chance. I don't deserve it, but I will seize it nonetheless. Questions and answers. Emil slipped into consciousness. He didn't remember falling asleep, but he felt that he had slept deeply and for a long time. Kieran, the humanist, had kept his word. The bed he lay in was small and layered with blankets, their warm bulk pressed against Emil's chest. It was comfortable but restraining. He sat up, sore muscles protesting, and leaned against the wall. The room was not much bigger than the bed, and there were no windows or decorations, but at least it was not a cave or a cage. Emil felt well, certainly much better than the day before, but that was tenuous. He had the notion of teetering on the edge of a cliff about to crash down. It wasn't over. Well, if he wasn't going to be lucid for very long, now was the time to ask questions. He put on the clothes Kieran had given him and opened the door to reveal the main room. The humanist appeared to be asleep at the kitchen table, his head on his arms. His dark red hair was no longer tied back, and it had sprung into a mass of curls. Emil stepped closer to him and waited. It was strange. Vampires were ever vigilant, even in sleep, but the humanist didn't stir. He had let his guard down completely. The brown cat leapt down from the hearth chair and stretched. She caught sight of Emil, hissed, and skittered up the stairs, tail bristled. This woke the humanist. He yawned and stretched, then smiled at Emil. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time to sleep. My power was at its limits. How did you sleep, by the way? Kieran motioned toward the empty chair across from him, and Emil sat. Peaceful, deep. He ran a finger over the table grain. Thank you. It was no trouble. You slept for about 2 days. I only nodded off maybe 30 minutes ago. How do you feel? Stiff and sore, but not in pain. Nothing is spinning, and I can finally smell again. But tell me, this is all temporary, isn't it? I know that. Unfortunately, yes. Those 2 days of rest healed the damage you did by straining yourself after regeneration. There is still the matter of withdrawal. Kieran paused and regarded Emil intensely. You realize that what you've decided to do, well, it's difficult. Yes, of course he knew. He had tried it before once, for Lily's sake, and failed. I'd like to ask you more about... Wait! I have questions. You can't expect me not to be curious. Kieran raised his eyebrows and chuckled. And I have some answers, but let's eat first. At the mention of food, Emil suddenly felt the hunger that had built up over 2 days spent asleep. You said you were out of food? That I did. Fortunately, I have many kind friends. Kieran stood and walked toward a narrow door by the hearth that Emil now realized must be some sort of pantry. No wonder he hadn't found anything in his cursory search of the room 2 nights ago. Suddenly Kieran swayed and stumbled. He grabbed one of the hearth chairs for support and steadied himself. Emil stared, surprised. Kieran smiled, but his voice was weak. Fine, I'm fine. Just a little tired. The humanist's kind friends turned out to be generous as well. There was dried fish and venison, berries and mushrooms, onions, cheese, brown bread with a jar of fruit preserve, and several jugs of a cold herbal tea, a mouth-watering spread. Emil ate slowly but steadily. Kieran unwrapped an onion and passed it from hand to hand between bites. Where am I? Emil asked when he had finished. These are Amurun lands? You are in the Skellige Isles, Ard Skellig to be precise. There were Amurun here for a few centuries after the tribes parted ways, but most have gone further west since then to Ophir. You're not Amurun? I am Tudet. But the Tudet crossed the Blue Mountains ages ago. They did, but this is my home. There was a finality in the humanist's voice that dissuaded Emil from probing further. He noticed the cat peeking out from under the hearth chair and quickly shifted topics. Why does that cat tolerate you? Danu knows no other scent but mine. I raised her from a kitten. Her trust takes a while to earn, but she'll eventually get used to you. Emil looked at the cat in its hiding place, and she backed further under the chair. He had a few more questions and was not sure what kind of answers he would receive. Kieran, using the name might have a positive effect. What is a humanist? There was a lengthy silence before the humanist spoke, cautiously. Well, it is both a philosophy and a lifestyle. Thus it is better shown than told. When you are well, I will show you. Emil sighed. Can you at least tell me what the withdrawal will be like, without being vague? He thought of his experience in a cave, the vision of the cage. He knew that whatever was coming was probably worse. I don't know for certain. You don't know? I have never tried human blood, but I have witnessed the withdrawal it can cause firsthand. I believe it will be similar to what you experienced in the cave, the vertigo and hallucinations you mentioned. We can add to that migraines, nausea and vomiting, and possibly seizures. Oh. Kieran's voice softened. I know what you were taught, that only the weak experience fear, but I promise you that is a lie. I'm not frightened, and I'm not weak. Of course. Emil stared down at the table, heat rising to his cheeks, but the humanist didn't seem to notice. Instead, he poured another cup of tea. I only intend to prompt self-reflection. Speaking of, are you willing to answer my question? If I am to help you, I'll need to know how your addiction began. It was an easy question. Emil had spent so much time reliving the past, analyzing each decision, each mistake, until he viewed a map of his failures. There was the beginning. It felt so long ago. He spoke quietly, slowly, and did his best to meet the humanist's eyes. As a child, I believed that I belonged among my peers until I grew up and discovered that I did not. I struggled to learn where I had gone wrong. Did I talk too much? Too little? About the wrong topics? Was it something in the way I carried myself, my appearance? This began to bother me. I remember everything started at a party. As usual, I hardly made an impression. I could hear my peers talking, mocking what I had already noticed about myself. Maybe they meant for me to hear. I don't know, but it angered me more than it should have. I downed 3, maybe 4 drinks. As the effects set in, well, I'm sure you can imagine. When I woke up, I had only hazy memories of the night before and a blistering headache. It was so miserable that I considered never getting drunk again, but it's hard to explain. When I encountered my peers that night, I noticed something both strange and wonderful. I was accepted into their conversations and plans without question. And so it went for many years. I had the acceptance of my peers at the expense of my sanity. I even met a girl I cared very much for. Emil sighed. Lily. I managed to decrease my intake for her, but I grew restless. She told me how much she loved my cleverness, how I noticed things others didn't, even my philosophical musings. But I had become so insecure that I did not believe it. Those traits had never won me acceptance before, so why now? So I kept drinking, and after Lily ended things, I drank even more to dull my emotions. The rest I told you last night, 2 nights ago. Emil trailed off. It was an agonizingly long time before Kjaran responded. I'm impressed. Very well articulated. You've given this a lot of thought. 50 years worth. I take it our time for questions and answers is over then, unless you have anything else you'd like to ask me? Nothing you'd answer. The humanist smirked. To business then. He pointed to the room Emil had slept in. That room will be yours. I do ask that you not leave this house until you've recovered. Feel free to read any of my books if you're bored. It's going to be a long few months. From the personal journal of Kjaran Fyles O Sionaith, year 1052, month 3, day 15. As I thought, his motivation is not based on a realization of the sanctity of human lives, but the determination to recover a true self, a freedom that he has lost. It is still an admirable motivation. I wonder if, in time, I could make him understand my philosophy. I shouldn't think too far ahead. I contacted the Druids and informed them that I will only be able to make house calls for the next few months. I can't risk a human entering this house right now, though I try not to imagine what my course of action would be if that did occur. Melior and the others understood, though I am sure they believe I am treating a human who must be quarantined and not a creature liable to kill them. Speaking of my patient, I cannot help but notice how our species has evolved between my generation and his. If I were to be injured or fall ill, my body would shift into its winged form so that I could protect myself while vulnerable. But his default state is human-like. To conserve energy, perhaps? Or to better blend in? The gross features of our human states are alike, but I have noticed the tops of his ears are rounded, not pointed. Maybe as the human population overtook the elven, it became more advantageous to mimic humans. As for his speech, he adds nasal resonances to some sounds in our language, perhaps a carryover of the human tongue he also speaks. I speak to him primarily in our language. He confessed while looking at one of my books that his ability to read and write in the human tongue lags a ways behind his speech and understanding. Year 1052, month 3, day 16. I have only just now found the time to write. His symptoms began a few hours after our conversation yesterday. He was returning a book to the shelf when he stopped, staring ahead with a blank look in his eyes. I counted 16 seconds before he blinked a few times and shook his head. I led him to a chair. Are you all right? Do you know where you are? He nodded. Just don't remember. What was I doing? An absence seizure, and an unusually long one at that. This is starting out more intensely than I had anticipated. Year 1052, month 3, day 18. I gave him decoctions to blunt the edges of the pain, but I'm weary of giving too much, lest it lead to a dependency. Still he cries out when the pain is too great, a piteous sound colored with fear. Many times already I've been tempted to use my power again, but the mental strain would be too great. I can't afford to be exhausted. To be honest, it's not his pain that concerns me, but what he may do to relieve it. I realize that he is tormented most by fighting the temptation, the urge to flee from here, find a human, even a small animal would do, Danu has gone into the woods for now, and end the suffering. Year 1052, month 3, day 21. I have never seen anyone vomit so much blood before. Concerning. I don't remember that happening the first time. Generational differences, perhaps? Year 1052, month 4, day 1. I sat on the edge of the bed. He lay on top of the blankets, shaking, sweating, and delirious from fever. It's times like these when I feel helpless, when I've done all I can and must wait and see. I was about to stand when I felt a hand, cold and slick with sweat, brush my arm. A voice muttered, "Don't leave. I'm so afraid." I left the room, shutting the door behind me. Instantly I felt the guilt and regret rise, but I swallowed it down. Had I not promised myself to keep my distance lest I fail again, lest he cannot take this pain and drowns himself in the blood of Ard Skellig, and I have to do what needs to be done? I could not bear it. Recovery and realization. The humanist had not exaggerated the symptoms of withdrawal. It was worse, much worse than what Emil had experienced in the cave. Even the analgesic concoction Kjaran mixed up could do little. At first, Emil tried to bear the pain with dignity, but as his condition worsened, he found there was no point. No one could be dignified while shaking so violently that any voluntary movement was impossible, or when vomiting profusely. He tried to keep track of the passing days, but he moved through time the way one moves through a murky bog, slowly and with effort. The days blurred together until he knew only instances of pain. In one instance, he howled as a burning sensation tore through his body, as if his blood were liquid flame. In others, he was lost in multi-sensory hallucinations of the cage, of nights years ago when he'd reached epic highs, and of his defeat near the well. Once, he was lucid enough to realize he had bit his own wrist in a fit of thirst. Most miserable of all was the feeling that he had been emptied out, and the leftover shell filled with a pernicious mixture of pain, doubt, and fear. The doubt was particularly insidious. It whispered to Emil at those times when the withdrawal was almost unbearable. "Are you sure, really sure this is what you want? You've learned your lesson. No need to torture yourself. Stop this. It's ridiculous. Are you trying to prove something to yourself, to this humanist?" Emil did not realize how much effort he spent to resist these whispers, until Kjaran came into the room one day and bandaged 4 small bloodied crescent moons on each of Emil's palms. Throughout everything the humanist was present, but Emil noticed that Kjaran had grown strangely silent and pensive, giving aid with only a few words. He was still kind, gentle even, but distant. "He knows you're weak. He knows you'll give up any day now." But if he surrendered, Emil sensed, there would be no third chance. It was now or never. Year 1052, month 4, day 25. He has not given up. I stand amazed. He possesses a tenacity I had not expected. With reservations, I am allowing myself to hope. Year 1052, month 5, day 2. There is truth in the old axiom that things get worse before they get better. I believe he's past the worst of it and starting to mend. He certainly has more energy. When I come in to give him food or the analgesic potion, he asks me questions, simple ones that he knows I will answer. What makes up the potion? Where are the other Skellige Isles in relation to here? I sense he is genuinely curious about these things, but the conversations also distract him from temptation and fear. I have also decided to distract myself, but from my hope as well as my fear. The junk room is a good place to start. I haven't cleaned it in centuries. I remember why I haven't cleaned this room. To call it a mess would be an understatement. Books in piles, old chairs and shelves that need repairing, crates with bottles of old concoctions I don't remember making. I could use this room for something other than storage if it were clean. Things went smoothly for a while until I found, buried under a pile of old fabric in the corner, a rucksack. It was stained and moth-eaten, but I had a fleeting recollection of tossing it here when it was only slightly worn. I worked through the knots binding the rucksack closed and pulled out, as if through a portal, relics from another time. Loose notebook pages that crumbled to dust at my touch, wads of a fabric that doesn't exist in this world, coins no longer in circulation, and a handful of stones. Reaching into the bottom of the sack, my hand closed in on a thick chain. So I'd put it there, thrown it in a bag with other souvenirs from my old life, and forgotten. I pulled out the chain. Dangling from it, of course, was the ring. Its 2 red stones had lost their luster, but the intertwined snakes were still sleek. I abandoned my attempt at cleaning after that and went outside. A light snowfall had begun. I brushed flakes from an old stump and sat. The ring in my hand felt heavy and cold. I lost myself to memories. The ring, adorning a clenched fist, glints in the torchlight. Its red ruby eyes glare at me accusatorily. Ashamed, I turn away. A hand, pale and unmoving, with the ring on its first finger. There's very little time. I take the ring. The northern woods, called Kedwen, centuries later. I twist the ring around my finger and listen for pursuers. Regretfully, I cannot remember when I stowed the ring in the rucksack and why. Perhaps it reminded me too much of the past when I was trying to forge ahead. From the house, I hear a whimpering. Nothing too alarming. These days, at least, he no longer screams, and he spends more time in the present. He hardly resembles the figure, racked with pain, lost in some hallucination, who asked me to stay by his bedside. Damn, there's no point in denying it. I feel guilty. When I took this ring, I swore an oath to myself. I swore to view the lives of my kind and the mortal races as equal in value, yet I've treated this boy as a potential mistake to be repeated. I would have taken the hand of a human who asked for comfort. It's true that I don't know the best way to help him, and I fear to repeat the mistakes of my past, but he deserves better. There was a knock at the door, and Kjaran entered. Emil was sitting up in bed, reading a book. His condition had started improving a fortnight ago and hadn't stopped. There was color in his young face again and strength behind his voice. "Are you feeling up for a short walk?" the humanist asked. "I think so." "Good. Get dressed. Here's a cloak. And come with me." In the months that Emil had spent housebound, the island had fallen under the spell of winter. Snow covered the ground and clung to tree branches, and clouds heavy with more of it blotted out the blue of the sky. It was a beautiful vista, but harsh. Emil winced and squinted as white light assaulted his eyes. "We can do this at night so it would be more comfortable," the humanist offered. "No, my eyes will adjust." There was something else about this light. Emil had seen plenty of winter and snow on the continent, but this brightness was different. It was harsh, rarefying. He felt naked, as if the light sought to illuminate his very core like sunrise into a dark cave. His small, fragile, yet no longer unrecognizable core. Wrapping the cloak tighter around him, he hastened his pace until he was walking next to Kjaran and not behind. Emil glanced back at his footprints. They were evidence to say he was alive, had walked here under his own power and with his head clear. It was against all odds. After 10 minutes of walking, they neared an oblong stone rising from the snow. A few meters beyond the snow, the ground sloped steeply downwards to a valley filled with white-tipped evergreens. At the far end of the valley was a harbor and several small buildings. It was a breathtaking vista. As they approached the stone, the air became denser and was filled with a low humming. The hair on Emil's arms stood up. "You know what this is?" Kieran asked. Emil brushed a fingertip against the stone. The humming grew louder. "A marker," he said, "for a vein of magic." Kieran nodded. "A post-conjunction relic, like us. Why did you bring me here?" The humanist sighed and looked past the stone to the horizon. "Two reasons. First, veins of magic like this have therapeutic properties. Mages and druids draw strength from them, and so can post-conjunction beings. Go on, try." Cautiously, Emil pressed his palm against the stone. At this, the humming reached a fever pitch, reverberating inside his skull. His hand vibrated in resonance with the stone, but it was working. He even felt that if he sat there long enough, he would have sufficient energy to shift forms. Suddenly, darkness swept into his peripheral vision. As he severed the connection, Emil heard Kieran say, "Careful now. Draw too much and you're liable to pass out." "It really works." "Of course, but it is intense." Emil could still feel the stone's oscillation in his hand. He shook it and rubbed it on his cloak to dispel the sensation. "What was the second reason?" The humanist hesitated. He looked nervous, unsure. Emil brushed the snow off a smaller stone and sat down. Finally, the humanist spoke. "You've been in that room for almost 2 months. I'm afraid all you've seen of Ard Skellig so far has been a shore cave and some woods at night, so—" He looked Emil squarely in the eye. "I wanted to show you your home." The words seemed to echo, ringing across the valley. Emil too echoed them. "My home?" "I told you that you could stay until your body and mind healed. Pardon the presumption, but I don't believe that time has come yet. So, until it does, you can consider my home to be your home." "I'm relieved," Emil realized. "Of course, I can't be considered healed when there is all this emptiness, void inside me. And if I left here now, I would have nowhere to go, no home to return to. The humanist must know this." "Thank you." Sunlight glinted off the snow crystals, strengthening the brightness that Emil found so harsh. Kieran fidgeted with something hanging from a chain around his neck. Emil could not see what it was, but knew it had not been there yesterday. Suddenly, Kieran spoke. "I'm sorry." The words were heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I underestimated you, and I drew away when you needed someone to be close. Emil, forgive me." Kieran's emerald eyes were earnest. At a loss for words, Emil nodded. His own name, unheard for 50 years, settled as a warmth in his chest.